Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. It's so great to have you guys here. And I am very excited about my guest, Dana K. White, because I love her YouTube channel. I love the things she talks about. I've had her on the podcast before to talk about decluttering and that sort of thing. And I'm excited to have her on again. So, welcome to the podcast, Dana.
Thanks so much for having me on.
And, Dana, why don't you start out by just telling us a little bit about you and your ministry?
Yeah, so I am Dana K. White. I teach decluttering. I teach it from the perspective of someone to whom this stuff does not come naturally. This is my personal biggest struggle that I've had to work through. And so, what began as just me not teaching anyone anything, just trying to journal my own way, learn about writing as I was figuring out my own home, has turned into the thing that I write about because I always wanted to be a writer. And so yeah, I teach through my books and my podcasts and YouTube and all the different things.
Okay, that's great. And what's the name of your podcast?
A slob comes clean.
Okay, Slob Comes Clean, you
That,
guys check that
yeah,
out and her YouTube channel.
yeah,
But what I love about you is that you come at it from a person who wasn't always great at being organized. Because I read a
right.
lot of your books and I relate because I was never that way either. So can you tell me first a little bit about your progression from, not really being organized and always having a messy house to how you got your house together? Can you tell us how that worked for you?
Yeah, I mean, I was born messy. I was always messy. Every space I ever touched, turned into a disaster, it felt like. But I had always assumed that once I had kids and was a stay-at-home mom, that it was all going to be easy, right? Like, because that was my life goal, right? So I had, worked for years, and then, I got married. I honestly thought that getting married was going to mean that my house was not a disaster anymore because I thought at that point I will care. It must just be that I don't care enough, right? Well, once I got married, did not help at all. Now I had another person's stuff and another person, in the mix, and once I had kids and then had the moment where I realized, oh, this not only didn't make it easier, it didn't fix me. It actually made it more difficult, right? That was when I kind of had an identity crisis because I had always been somebody who could dive into something, figure it out, tackle it, be successful. And I could not seem to do this thing. And it was not for lack of trying, it wasn't for lack of working. It was just like I thought I was doing what other people were doing. And it was not having the effect on my house that it seemed other people had on theirs. So, like I said, I wanted to be a writer. That was my life dream. And I found out what blogs were back in 2008. And I thought, that's it. I've got to have one. This is the thing. And I didn't start one for a year and a half because my house was a disaster. And I thought, I have to get this figured out before I start writing, right? Because I know myself. I know I throw myself into projects and I let everything go at the expense of that project. And I was like, I can't do that. I've got to figure out my house. It was so bad. So I really, as a compromise, honestly, it was in the midst of a conversation with God. I was praying, God, please. Well, honestly, I had prayed many times, God, please make me organized. At the moment where I had the idea to start this blog was actually me just sharing my frustration with God. Why is it that you have not answered my prayer? Why have you not changed me when I have begged you to change me? And it's keeping me from doing the thing that I felt like he was calling me to do. And that was when God just basically said, well, write about that. And I was like, oh, okay. That's a really good idea, God. Okay. So I thought it was a temporary practice thing where I was going to work on my house, stay focused on that, get it perfect in a couple of months, right? And then I would start writing about the things that I actually felt qualified to write about. And yeah, joke's on me because now it's 2025. I started that in 2009. For the first several years, I was not teaching anyone anything. In fact, people would say, please teach us what you're doing. And I would say, why would you want to learn this from me? That doesn't make any sense. Right. And then I finally came to a point where I both realized this was the thing God wanted me to write about. right? Like this was actually the reason he placed the desire to write in my heart. And uh there was a need for it. Like the reason I resisted teaching was I was like, but don't you want somebody to tell you how to have a perfect house? Because that's what I thought I wanted when I started, right? But instead, I realized, oh, actually, there is a need for what I now can uniquely teach because most of the people who write about organizing are writing about it because they like it, they're good at it, right? And be, our brains work differently. That was the hugest thing that God showed me was I created your brain the way that I created your brain on purpose. It's not a mistake, right? The fact that your brain works very differently from the brains of organized people who usually write about this stuff is not a mistake. It just means that you have to figure out what does work for you and your unique personality, your unique brain, right? And so because of that, um, I came to this point where I realized, okay, I can come in and teach the things that most of the people writing about this stuff they didn't know people like me needed to know, right? Like there's a communication gap between naturally organized people and people like me who are the opposite of naturally organized, right? Like this and the person who's trying to be helpful doesn't necessarily know what it is that needs to be explained to someone like me. And so that's where I come in. I can never tell you how to have a perfect house, but I will tell you I can teach you how to go from completely overwhelmed and confused about why this is so hard to, oh, I get it now and I can do this. Um, so so yeah, that's basically how I came to this point of this being the thing that I teach as I figured it out in my own home publicly, right? Like I mean I didn't tell anybody in my real life what I was doing. I was using a fake name there in the beginning. Um, but I was writing about it in real time. And so I would figure out something. You know, one of my biggest concepts that I teach is the container concept. And I honestly, if it was not for the fact that I was doing this and writing about it while I was doing it, I don't think I'd be teaching that concept today. Because once you understand it, it's such a light bulb that just changes everything that it feels so obvious, right? But because I was writing about it in the moment where I went, wait a minute, containers are meant to serve as boundaries? Like this makes it all so much easier. It changes how I view my stuff and my space and everything. Because I was just like not teaching anyone anything, then people who were reading it said, what? I didn't know this either. Where before, I think if I just figured that out on my own without doing it publicly, I would have been like, okay, I figured this thing out, but I'm not going to tell anybody because it's so embarrassing that I didn't know this before. Right? Like that was the thing. So the fact that it was being done in this way actually is what helped me know, oh, so it's not just me that didn't know this or that, needs to figure this out. And I was a teacher before I stayed home with my kids. And so it is part of my personality to teach things.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. I think it was in this book where you said declutter first, then organize. And then and that I thought that was super helpful. And then also just that whole container principle. The first time I watched one of your little videos on it, I thought it was mind blowing. And I'd like you to
Yeah.
describe it for everybody. And also I'd like to say it is possible because we live in a 125-year-old house and our closet is a little over 4 feet wide. It's not a walk-in closet,
Mhm.
and we don't have a dresser in our room. And we fit all our
Yeah.
clothes in that
Yeah.
closet and they're not overflowing. It's really easy to put them away. So I'd like to hear
Right.
more about it.
Yeah. No. Okay. So I always thought if you, no, okay, I should have to be clear. I, if you had told me that I didn't know what containers were for, I would have been offended, right? Like, because if I would have said, of course I know what they're for. Hello. But I didn't know what they were for, right? Like, I just knew organized people loved containers. And I was like, well, containers are for putting things in. And so you have all this stuff, you get containers to put it in. But when I would buy containers, bring them into my home, it never looked the way it did on the package. It never looked the way it did in my friends' homes. I mean, like, and so I didn't know what was the difference, right? So the example that I always give is let's say that my friend has this adorable um, beautiful craft shelf, right? And my kids are over there playing at, and my kids are grown now, right? But at the time when I was figuring this out, let's say my kids are over there playing at her kid's house and they're all doing crafts and they're all so happy. And I'm like, oh, her craft shelf is adorable. Why is it that hers is so cute and mine is so scary because I have an entire closet for crafting and we're all scared to open it because everything's going to fall out, right? Like that was just like, okay, so what is it that's different about hers and mine? She has a red bucket. I don't have a red bucket. Okay. All right. So I'm going to get me a red bucket just like hers. And I bring it home and I fill it with crayons. And then I still have 700 crayons left. And my thought process was always, oh, why doesn't this work for me the way that it works for her? I guess I need two more red buckets. And so I would bring two more red buckets home, fill those up with crayons as well, have to pile them on top because they were, didn't completely fit. And then I would go to put the red buckets on the shelf and they didn't all fit on the shelf. And I would think, oh my word, why is this so hard? Why doesn't this work the way I think it's going to work? Okay. And I would buy another shelf. And then at some point, I didn't have room for more shelves. And at that point, I thought, well, the actual solution here would be for me to have a bigger house. I can't afford a bigger house. Therefore, I am doomed to be disorganized, even though the friend's house is smaller than mine. But it wasn't registering like what the difference was. I was just like, this doesn't seem to work for me the way that it works for other people. When I was decluttering one day and talking to myself, which is how I've been able to do all this, right? With my life is lots of words. But I was talking to myself and I was just saying the word container. And it just hit me that the word contain is inside the word container. And I was like, wait, what? A container is supposed to contain, like firefighters work to contain a fire. They create a boundary. If they can keep the fire inside the boundary, they can keep it under control. If it goes outside the boundary, it gets out of control, right? So the boundary is the key. That's the containing. And I went, oh, a container is actually supposed to serve as a boundary, serve as a limit. And then when I do the exact same thing, but I'm viewing the container as a limit as opposed to something to hold things, then I have the red bucket and I pick out my favorite crayons first and I put them in the red bucket. And when the red bucket is full, something happens in my brain and I realize, oh, I guess I don't actually need 1,000 crayons, right? Like where before I was picking up every crayon and saying, is this a good crayon? Does it have value? Might I ever use it? Is it useful? Like all the different things that you hear are supposed to be the way that you declutter, right? Like those are the things other people say, like, oh, ask yourself, have I used this in a year or whatever? And I'm like, all of those things meant that I was spending exorbitant amounts of time and energy, which then caused me to not want to declutter because I didn't want to spend that time and energy, right? On looking at a crayon that was a little nub. Well, I mean, I'm a really good person, right? And so I know that broken crayons still color, right? Like I am the one, I'm like, yes, absolutely. I can use something with that. I can melt that down and make a
That's just
little
what was
rainbow
going through my
crayon and
head.
a,
You could put it with the
yes, like
little
in a
leaves
heart
and the wax
shape.
paper and yeah.
All of the, and like it's Valentine's Day, my kids could take that to school and you make my world colorful or whatever. Like that is how my brain works. And so to ask, is it useful means I'm going to keep everything. My house was a disaster as long as I was looking at my stuff that way. But when I went, oh, the red bucket is the container. The shelf is the container. It's the limit to how many red buckets I can have and my space be functional. And when I looked at it that way, I went, I can love this item. It can be useful. It can be valuable. It can be all the good things. And yet, the facts are the facts. The space that I have is the space that I have. And if I try to keep more than will fit in that space, it's never going to be under control. There's no hope of it ever being under control. And it somehow just freed me from so much of the decluttering angst I had had before that, right? Because I wasn't rejecting things, I was accepting reality. And there's such a difference there, right? Like this physical reality of the actual space just took all that pressure off to make all these decisions about what should I and shouldn't I keep, and instead go, does it deserve space in here? Like there could be 10 amazing things, but if I only have room for three, then somehow my brain is able to identify the most important three. Because I think that pressure, one time, I have a video where my husband and I were decluttering the mug shelf, right? And I said something about, okay, so this one's your least favorite. Okay, well, we'll get rid of that so that we'll have room for everything. And he specifically said, he said, thank you for calling it my least favorite. He goes, I have memories associated with that mug. And so something about still being able to say that I love it and that it means something to me, but it doesn't fit, so I have to get rid of it, is the thing that lets me be willing to get rid of it. If you come to me and say, this mug is not that important,
Mhm.
right? Well, I'm going to want to argue with that, or even with myself, right? Like if I'm having to say, this is a bad mug, I want to protect that mug and I want to remember all the things and all that. But instead, it's like, it is hard. Decluttering is hard, but it takes that pressure off when I get to blame the space for what I
Yeah.
can and can't keep.
And I feel too, it does help me when I first choose the things like you said that I like the best.
Mhm.
Because I first choose the things I like the best. And in the last 3 years, we were traveling a lot and living in 1 and 2 bedroom apartments. And I could see because I had so few clothes because we had to fit what we could fit in a car. My husband was doing travel physical therapy that even with such few clothes I brought along, there was still some I didn't wear. Whereas at home, when you have a big closet with tons of clothes, it's like you don't even know what you're
Yeah,
wearing. So picking out your favorites first helps. And then when I was decluttering, what helped is to have a should get rid of box because I had a hard time making emotional break. So the ones I really had a hard time, I put it in the should get rid of box. Then I'd already made a little bit of
interesting.
emotional break. And then, a year later, whatever, it was pretty easy to get rid of most everything in that box.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's so like you said, your closet is small, right? And I used to, and the thing that I, coach people through a lot is I would look at my stuff and I would think, what system do I need to be able to keep, to be able to manage this stuff, right? And in reality, I needed to look at my space
Mhm.
and go, what space do I have? What stuff deserves a place
Yeah,
in
that's
this
good.
space? Like it's such a different, it's just a shift of things, but it changes everything. And that's why I always say, like, you mentioned something about declutter before you organize. I just encourage you to just declutter and see if you even do need to organize.
Oh, that's
Because
good.
that has been my experience
Hmm.
was, I was like, well, I guess I'll just declutter first, and because that's how far gone I was that when I first started. And I honestly achieved what I always wanted that I thought I had to organize to get. I achieved that through decluttering. And so I would rather have three things on a shelf. I can see all three. There's open space around them so I can reach it, get it out and all that. That is better to me than a, any kind of complicated system, right? Like I would rather just have fewer things so that they naturally stay more organized
Yes.
and I
Hmm.
don't have to, keep anything complicated. I don't have the bandwidth for
Well,
complicated
and then you don't have
stuff.
to spend all your time cleaning and organizing and all that.
Yeah,
which is very
exactly.
nice. And you also talk about
Yeah.
a clutter threshold principle, which I didn't remember seeing before. And I know we haven't talked too
Mhm.
much about Dana's new book, you guys, but Dana's new book, it also talks a lot about the spiritual principles behind some of these. So it's a little different than their other books. But one thing, I don't know, you probably have mentioned this in your other books, and I didn't catch it till this one. What's the clutter threshold?
So your clutter threshold is the amount of stuff that you personally can easily keep under control. Okay. So it's what can you handle? It is not an aesthetic preference, like, and this is one of those things that kind of gets me a little, but when people, they're like, oh, I can't stand having a lot of stuff around. I'm like, okay, but you know what? If it's not your house, who cares? Right? Like it's, the preference is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about what can you handle, not like what do you like, what can you keep under control? So if a space is continually getting out of control, there's too much stuff in it. That is my definition for clutter is anything that continually gets out of control. There's too much. So there needs to be less until it gets to the point where it can stay under control. So as I worked on my house, I again had thought I needed to organize and just decluttered and saw, oh, everything is easier when I just have less stuff. Everything I do in my home is easier to do when I'm not having to move all these things and find all these things, and there's just less stuff. And I hit a point where I realized, oh, I can do this. Like I can handle this amount of stuff. And so that is the goal is to reach your clutter threshold by decluttering until you feel in control of your space. And a daily 5-minute pickup can get things put back, into place. That means things actually have a place, right? So the thing I always teach is first declutter to the container because that is something outside of you that's not ambiguous at all. It's just the reality of the physical space. If it is still getting out of control, even though technically when everything's put away, it all fits, then you have more stuff than you can handle. And you need to keep getting rid of stuff until it is an amount that you can handle.
Yeah, and another thing you talked about in the book, which have we even said the name of the book? I don't think we
I don't
have.
think so.
What is Tell us the name of the book quick.
Yeah. The book is Jesus Doesn't Care About Your Messy House because my goal is to dive deep into the shame part of this that a lot of women, specifically Christian women, Jesus is in the title, so the angle that we're coming from here, right? Yeah, it's a real shame issue for a lot of women, and so we're gonna, I talk about what the Bible actually says about this issue and how God sees you, and remove the shame so that then you can, move forward.
Yeah,
So
and I think you
yeah.
talk, I mean, because some people, even when I read it, I'm thinking, hmm, I mean, is this true? Because I automatically
Mhm.
think, well, when I had a really messy house all the time, and I don't anymore, I was feeling so overwhelmed, and I'm like, Jesus does care about me feeling overwhelmed. He wants to have a good space for our kids. So you explain that more in the book, and I like
I mean,
how you
it's
explained it.
60,000 words.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's 60,000 words to support that statement. So
right. So
but I absolutely do mean it. Like I do mean it, and that's the point of the book. There's no trick like, oh, in the end she's going to say actually Jesus cares very much. He cares about you, he cares about what's important to you, he cares about your family, he cares about all of that. But is he horrified by the fact that you struggle with messiness? No, he is not. He created your brain to work the way that it works, and accepting that this is not a spiritual failure that you struggle in your home is actually the freedom that people need to move forward. I mean, I would say almost all of the emails that I get, which I get emails every single day from women saying, I've finally changed my home. And they will tell me that the number one thing, like the turning point for them, was realizing there wasn't something wrong with them. Right? Because when I was bewildered in my home, I was like, why is this so hard for me? I'm an intelligent person and I can't do this. That was like, what? What in the world? And then accepting, no, God created my brain to work this way. There are ways to do this with the brain that I have, right? Like, so there's hope in the actual ability to change. But the key is knowing because so many times you take this thing that is already a struggle, right? Like it's already all consuming. And then when somebody tries to be helpful and says, well, God is a God of order, that's not a helpful statement to the person. It's also out of context, but it's not a helpful statement to the person who is struggling in her home. Like that, all that does, they think they're being helpful, but all that makes her feel is, okay, you took this thing now that was already a struggle, and now you're telling me that I'm also spiritually deficient, like that I somehow don't trust God enough or whatever, and it's like, okay, so now that is the part that often becomes debilitating for so many women. So I just tackle those things head on, all those things
Yeah,
that people
I like
like to
that. And it didn't
say
occur
as a helpful thing.
yeah, it didn't occur to me
Yeah.
to be shamed about it back when I was,
Hmm.
I had my house out of order. I guess I was never shamed about it, but I've also noticed that in my
Good.
arena too, that a lot of people do go the shame route. I just feel like, God takes us by the hand and helps us.
Mhm.
He doesn't condemn us. And I like what you said in the book. I think this is what I was going to mention before is that so many of us have the struggle because we are creative people. And I always thought if I didn't
Absolutely.
do crafts, if I didn't read, if I didn't write, I'd never have a problem. A lot of my problem in my house is because I do so many different things. I have all that stuff in my house and to try and find a spot for all of it. So that was interesting when I read that in your book.
Yeah. And I think, like we were talking about the container concept, there are a lot of people whose homes are under control and they can't imagine them not being under control, who are like, wait, what? You didn't understand that the space was the limit? I mean, so that's one of those core things that is a difference in the creative brain, right? Is that we see the world differently. That was the biggest understanding for me as I was writing and sharing anonymously, but there were people reading it. As people started to read it, they said, me too. That's how my brain works. These are the thoughts that have gone through my mind as well. And I saw that they were all highly creative women. That was the common thread. And I went,
Mm.
oh, okay. God gave me this brain that he designed to be creative, which I've always been very thankful for. But it is directly related to the fact that I see my space and my stuff differently, and that can cause a lot of problems. And so that was a big part of me accepting how my brain works and going, okay, I don't need to fight against that. Right. Like, because so many times when I was trying what other people said should work and I didn't understand all of this, I was like, if it doesn't work for me, then I thought the answer to this is for me to have a different brain than what I have. When in reality, I needed to do things in the way that actually worked for my brain. For one example, some helpful advice, if you can follow it, that some people will give is never leave the room without, um, you know, picking something up to take to the room where you're going, right? And a friend of mine who is has very similar to me, we were theater friends in college, right? She called me in tears one time because she said she had been to this, some speaker at a mom's group or something who was there to help you get your house under control. And the woman gave that advice and she said, she has always known, she's suffered with severe ADHD. And she said, I'm never going to remember to do that. And the woman said, well, then I can't help you. And what
Oh.
she heard was, I can't be helped.
Mm.
Right. And so, a lot of people are like, no, just start remembering to do this. And I'm like, well, but what if I'm never going to remember to do that? Okay, well, then we have an alternate solution, right? Like we do a 5 minute pickup, a focused 5 minute pickup. It is for this brain type, it is much easier to do a focused 5 minutes. This is what I'm doing for these 5 minutes. I'm picking things up and putting them away, as opposed to stop laying things down without realizing you're laying it down. Because if you don't realize you're laying it down, then, that's like,
Yeah.
how
I'm
are
the
you
same
supposed to stop
way.
doing it if you had no awareness? Yeah.
I wouldn't notice it and I wouldn't remember it. Either one, it wouldn't even cross my mind.
Right.
And when we had little kids,
Yeah.
what we used to do is we do the 5 minute pickup, but what we do is we put three songs where we get put music on
Hmm.
and then put really loud, and then we'd all race around putting things away and we'll say, see if we can get the house clean in three songs. And so everybody do it. So you make it
Yeah.
fun. And then that's something you can
Yeah.
remember to do. So I like that. But as I was reading your book too, I thought of the container, the clutter threshold. I thought I'm like that with work because I am not a person who has a big work threshold. And I feel like, oh, that's going to be
Hmm.
so easy. I'll just whip out a book or I'll whip out a class.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to fit way more in the container than can really fit. So I just think your principles
Hmm.
are so interesting and so helpful to so many people. People who struggle with this and are not
Yeah.
naturally cleanies.
Yeah. I mean, it's been. I love people, right? Like I'm a people person. I enjoy being around people. Not that I don't also enjoy alone time, right? But I love people. And it has been so fun and so satisfying to meet so many people in this place of honesty, right? Like in this place of us talking deeply about the things that we struggle with and all. I'm so thankful that God had this plan. It is so much better than my plan. I don't think I would have been writing about something. I mean, one of the reasons I didn't want to write until I had my house under control was I didn't want to feel like I needed to hide my house, right? Because that was a shame thing for me. And so I was like, well, I want to get this done so that I don't have to live in fear that someone will find out what my house looks like. Um, but this path of just like being honest about struggles, being honest about everybody has struggles. What if your home is not your struggle, there is something else. I mean, it is fact, right? That everybody has their struggle, their weakness, and God was asking me to give him my weakness, not give it to him to accomplish my plans for that weakness, which is to remove it and take it away and let it not be weak anymore, but instead to give it to him to use as he pleased to bring glory to him. And that is so much more satisfying and rich than anything I would personally plan. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I just want to, I know where time is short here, but I just want to ask one other thing. So I remember you saying something
Mhm.
in the book about boundaries giving you freedom. Can you just tell us what you meant by that?
Yeah. Yeah. So many times people assume when they hear the container concept or they're already feeling overwhelmed with their stuff, right? Like they're already feeling um like this is never going to work, whatever, and they hear the container concept and they have a little bit of hope, but the assumption is that the way the container concept will work is that I will fill this space with things, the shelf or this drawer, whatever it is. I'll fill this shelf with things, and then I'll have to make some really, really hard decisions. But in reality, just knowing that there is a boundary makes everything look different,
Mm.
right? Like, so it rarely ever comes to the point where the space is full and then you can't put anything else in it. In reality, just knowing that there's a limit to how much space I have means that from the first item I pick up, I go, not worth the space. Not worth the space, right? And so having those boundaries is such a gift and just takes so much of the pressure off, right? And I think that it's the same way. Well, I don't think that, I mean, I know it's the same way in God's design for, how we're supposed to live, right? Like the biblical principles that he lays out. There's so much freedom in that. It feels like it's going to be restrictive when you're just looking from the outside in, like, oh, if I have to give up this or if I have to give up that. But there's so much freedom in that. For me, honestly, it was my pride. I didn't like to be the um slob. I didn't want to be known as that. But the freedom that comes from giving that to God, from him wanting to be involved in every aspect of my life, from him wanting to use whatever he wants to use, there's so much freedom in that it's so worth it
That's good.
to live within those boundaries. Yeah.
Well, I feel like you're just really a help to people like myself and a lot of people who are
Thank
listening
you.
who struggle with these things. So I just really
Yeah.
thankful for all the resources you created to help people. So why don't you just tell everybody where they can find you, your resources, your new book, and all of that?
Yeah. So you can always find me pretty much anywhere just by searching Dana K. White. You do have to put the K in there because there's a man who runs the Ultimate Fighting something or other that is Dana White. So you'll find him if you don't put the K in there. But just yeah, search with the K. My website is A Slob Comes Clean. That's the website that I started back in 2009, and it's still there. But it has the links to all the different places where you can find me on the internet. So
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast, Dana. It was great to have you
thank
today.
you. It
And
was
thank
very
you,
fun. Thank you.
everybody, for being here. It was nice to have you here, and I will see you next time.